Hi history lovers, and welcome back to the channel where I bring you new videos every Friday on a range of historical topics. Today on History Calling we're asking, could Anne of Cleves have remarried after she was unceremoniously dumped by Henry VIII in 1540? This is a query I got in the comments on my video looking at Anne's funeral a couple of months ago, which I'll leave linked on screen and below, and I thought it was a really interesting idea and worthy of a video in its own right. So here we are. To answer this question, we'll look at the grounds on which the annulment between Henry and Anne was granted, which included claims of bigamy, problems in the bedroom department, and a lack of consent from one of the two parties involved. I'll then discuss whether Anne was legally and religiously free to remarry, and more specifically, when she might have been able to do so. The video will also cover the potential difficulties and financial pitfalls a second marriage might have entailed, and I'll finish up by telling you not just whether I think she could have remarried, but why I think she didn't. Please remember to like this video, subscribe to the channel with notifications switched on so that YouTube keeps you up to date with my uploads, and follow me over on Instagram. There's a link to my account in the description box, along with links to books, documentaries, movies and TV shows about Anne's life. The story of Henry's shortest marriage is well known. After seeing this portrait of her by the famed artist Hans Holbein, he agreed to wed Anne of Cleves, sight unseen, and she arrived in England at the end of 1539. Their first meeting on New Year's Day 1540 went disastrously wrong, however, after Anne failed to recognise Henry, who she'd never met and who was in disguise, and he was mortally offended. It didn't help that he discovered at that point that he didn't really fancy her either, as he didn't feel she was as beautiful as she'd been made out to be. He tried unsuccessfully to find a way out of marrying her, delaying the wedding by a couple of days in order to do so, but ultimately had to go through with the ceremony on the 6th of January. Just 6 months later, Henry had fallen for one of Anne's ladies-in-waiting, the young Katherine Howard, and was determined to find a way out of his unhappy fourth marriage. This is where the famous annulment comes in, as Henry had the marriage dissolved on 3 grounds. The first was that Anne had been pre-contracted to marry the future Francis I, Duke of Lorraine, at the age of 11, and that this pre-contract had never been properly voided. This meant that she was in a state of bigamy through her marriage to Henry. Of course, it meant little that Anne had declared herself as free as a bird before the wedding to Henry, and that the pre-contract had been looked into by his agents during the 1539 marriage negotiations, and no impediment had been found. Francis apparently didn't think there was any issue either. He went on to marry Christina of Denmark, Dowager Duchess of Milan, in 1541, a woman Henry himself had once wanted to wed, and who supposedly made a famous remark to the effect that she would be happy to become Queen of England if only she had 2 heads, a sly reference to the grisly fate of Anne Boleyn back in 1536. Reason number 2 was that Henry said the marriage with Anne of Cleves had never been consummated. Based on Anne's own comments to her ladies-in-waiting that he merely kissed her good night and good morning when they shared a bed, this claim would appear to be true, and on its own would have been good enough for an annulment. Not wanting to take any blame himself, however, the ever-gallant Henry insisted that he was able to perform the deed, just not with her, and for good measure he cast aspersions on her virtue and made disparaging remarks about her body. What a prince. Reason number 3 was that Henry claimed that despite having sent for Anne and being the King of England, someone who had previously been so determined to get his own way that he'd broken with the church in Rome in order to marry Anne Boleyn, he'd been pressured into the marriage with Anne of Cleves, and it was therefore illegal due to a lack of consent on his part. This might seem pretty laughable to us, given that the whole system of royal and aristocratic marriage in this period relied on people, usually women, being married off to unknown candidates with little or no say in the matter, but that doesn't change the fact that it was true. Henry, as we've seen, had been incredibly reluctant to go through with the ceremony. As the wedding approached, he had declared to his top minister, Thomas Cromwell, that he resented the fact that he would need to, quote, "against my will put my neck into the yoke," and said that, "if it were not to satisfy the world and my realm, I would not do that I must do this day for none earthly thing." He also tried to find some loophole to get out of the marriage, having his lawyers look at Anne's pre-contract with the Duke of Lorraine again, but of course it was to no avail, and the wedding went ahead. Anne was informed of the annulment proceedings on the 6th of July, and despite her initial shock and grief, she quickly acquiesced to the end of her marriage, sending back her wedding ring with the request that it be broken into pieces as it was a thing of no force nor value, and throwing herself on Henry's mercy. Relieved at her speedy compliance, Henry was generous. The annulment was granted on the 9th of July, and as part of the deal, Anne was given a clutch of houses, including the former Boleyn family home, Hever Castle, plenty of money, and forbidden from leaving England ever again, presumably so that she couldn't return to mainland Europe, slandering Henry and discussing his failures in the bedroom. Henry went on to marry Katherine Howard, then, after that went south and he'd had her executed in 1542, he wed Catherine Parr in 1543, who outlived him. By contrast, Anne of Cleves, who stayed in England until her own death in July 1557 at the age of 41, never remarried. This brings us to the crux of this video. Could she have done so if she'd wished? I think the answer to this question partly depends on what point in time we're talking about. Francis of Lorraine died in June 1545. Henry VIII died on the 20th of January 1547. I would therefore say that from the 20th of January 1547 onwards, there was absolutely no legal or religious impediment to Anne marrying again, as both of the men she had supposedly been engaged or wed to were now dead. But what about the 5 years between her annulment and the death of Francis, and the 19 months after that prior to Henry's death? To answer this, let's start by looking at the wording of the annulment, in which we see something a little strange. It declares that the clergy of both provinces have received the King's Commission recited, dated Westminster, the 6th of July, 32nd year of the reign of Henry VIII. After mature deliberation, they have found the marriage null by reason of a pre-contract between Lady Anne and the Marquis of Lorraine, that it was unwillingly entered into and never consummated, and that the King is at liberty to marry another woman, and likewise the Lady Anne free to marry. Westminster, 9th of July, 1540. This document makes no bones about the fact that Anne was free to marry again right away, just as Henry was, and yet at the same time it contains a serious flaw in logic. If Anne's marriage to Henry was invalid partly on the grounds of her pre-contract to Francis of Lorraine, then how could she be free to marry anyone else? Surely that impediment still stood. This reminds me of when Henry had Anne Boleyn executed in part on charges of adultery, yet also had their marriage annulled. If she'd never been married to him, how could she have committed adultery against him? Clearly, the king was a man who liked to have his cake and eat it. In a letter he wrote on the 10th of July 1540, his own language is a little more fuzzy than the official document. He says that the said marriage neither was at the beginning viable, nor by any act done since is yet of that sort as doth bind us to continue the same, but leaveth us both in our former liberty. This could be taken to imply that Anne was indeed free to marry elsewhere, or that she had merely returned to her former state of liberty, such as it was. In other words, that she was back where she started, still pre-contracted to Francis of Lorraine and unable to wed. The contents of this letter were not legally binding, though, and it was the declaration of the clergy and Parliament that mattered, and they had clearly stated that Anne could marry again. Why, though, we might wonder, did they include the pre-contract at all, given that there were 2 other perfectly valid excuses for the annulment? I think there are a couple of reasons. One was so that Henry could reject any pressure put on him in the future to remarry Anne. An undissolved pre-contract could not be got around in the way that a lack of consent on his part or the issue of non-consummation could have been. It enabled Henry to say, if he wanted to, that he would love to remarry Anne, if only it wasn't for that pesky issue with Francis of Lorraine. It also meant that Anne's legal position was conveniently vague, convenient for Henry, that is. By the terms of the annulment, Henry had made Anne a very wealthy woman, and her new title was that of the king's sister. Had she remarried, though, her belongings would have become the property of her husband, and might ultimately have descended to him or their children. This would have made any future spouse a very wealthy man and technically a member of the extended royal family. Henry had had some experience of his sisters marrying without his consent in the past, most famously when Mary Tudor, Queen of France, married Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, and he hadn't been happy about it. By leaving Anne in this legal limbo, he kept control of her. For as long as Frances lived, any new marriage Anne made without Henry's consent would be under a cloud, with the king able to say that she was still pre-contracted to Francis and that the statement in the 1540 annulment that she was free to remarry was an error. At the same time, had he wanted to marry her off for any reason, he could have done so, because of course the annulment also said that she was at liberty to wed again. As for the 19 months between the death of Francis and that of Henry, I think the king would have had more difficulty preventing or avoiding any marriage Anne might have made during this time, but fortunately for all involved, she didn't try her luck. So we've established that Anne could technically remarry in England as soon as the annulment was through, but in reality Henry could have stopped her or annulled any union she made up to Francis's death in 1545 on the grounds of their pre-contract. Did Anne even consider herself unmarried though, and would other people, especially potential suitors, have considered her a free agent? This comes down to an issue of personal religious beliefs. Anne never expressed any wish to remarry except after the death of Katherine Howard, when she hoped that Henry might take her back. This might suggest that she doubted the validity of the annulment in the eyes of God and felt that Henry was the only man to whom she was or could be married between 1540 and his death. Others may well have felt the same, seriously limiting her pool of potential husbands. What's more, Anne's annulment had been granted according to the laws of England, and many of Europe's royal families were Catholic. Without an annulment from the Pope, she may still have been considered married in the eyes of the Roman Catholic Church. This is all supposition, though. Anne never publicly stated that she felt the annulment was illegal and that she was Henry's lawful wife. She knew better than to do that. And the legality of the annulment outside of England was never put to the test, though it's interesting to speculate what would have happened if it had been. This brings us to the issue of who on earth Anne could have married, even if she'd wanted to take another husband and believed herself able. She was required by the terms of her annulment to stay in England, so in reality a foreign prince was out unless Henry or one of his successors gave her permission to leave the country, which they never did, despite her asking. The most likely candidate would therefore have been an Englishman, but it would have been a brave or foolish man indeed who would have risked the king's ire by marrying his one-time wife and quasi-sister. After all, how would Henry have reacted to the thought that Anne might be sharing his inadequacies in the bedroom with her new husband, and even comparing the two? A lady of Anne's rank supposedly couldn't marry just anyone either. When Mary Tudor married the Duke of Suffolk, one of the complaints about it was that he wasn't good enough for her, not being of royal blood himself. Anne of Cleves wasn't an English princess and a dowager queen of France, but she was no farmer's daughter either, and there was arguably no one in the country of sufficient status to marry her except Henry. Nevertheless, as Mary Tudor had shown, rank was not an insurmountable problem to the determined. You could marry someone beneath you, as her brother Henry did on numerous occasions too, and the marriage would still stand. So why didn't Anne remarry at any point, not even after the death of Henry, when she was clearly free to do so? We have no evidence in the records as to why she remained alone for the rest of her life, but I would suggest 3 possible reasons. One is that this life gave her great financial independence and the ability to live more or less as she pleased as long as she stayed in England. Another is that she simply didn't meet the right man. Remember, she was living a fairly quiet life at her houses, only occasionally coming to court and possibly speaking such poor English that it would have been difficult for anyone not fluent in German to converse with her. The last is that she didn't want to remarry and take the risk of dying in childbirth or finding herself shackled to someone who turned out to be a possessive and oppressive bully. She was that rare thing in Tudor England, a filthy rich and almost completely independent woman. It would have been a lot to give up. So, to conclude, I believe that Anne could definitely have remarried after the 28th of January 1547, when both Francis of Lorraine and Henry VIII were dead, and that Henry would have had a hard time arguing that she couldn't take another husband once Francis was dead. Her position between 1540 and 1545 was more complicated and dependent upon Henry, but marriage wouldn't have been impossible if she'd had his blessing. However, she may not have believed herself free to marry in the eyes of God before Henry's death, and in any case there were definite legal and financial advantages to remaining single and in control of her own destiny, household and money. What do you think, however? Could Anne have remarried, and if so, at what point do you think she could have done so? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this video, please remember to give it a like and make sure you're subscribed to the channel with notifications switched on. I'll be back next week, and until then, keep learning.